Hey guys, Jake from 80/20 Media back again today with a video on Ford's 7.3 Powerstroke. The 7.3 Powerstroke was released in 1994. It is a V8 turbo diesel and was produced all the way up until 2003 when it was phased out for the 6.0 Powerstroke. The predominant reason that it was phased out was due to emissions regulations, and so the 7.3 Powerstroke is the last of Ford's pre-emission diesel engines. In the sense that it does not have any of the emission systems that are found in the 6.0 and on. And so the only emission system on the 7.3 Powerstroke is a diesel oxidation catalyst, which is the equivalent of a catalytic converter, but it does not have exhaust gas recirculation. It doesn't have a DPF, SCR, or any of those things that you find on today's diesel engines. And so while we do consider it a modern diesel engine, it is kind of a pre-emissions modern diesel engine. And the 7.3 Powerstroke is a special engine, one, because I own one of them, but two, because it is also widely considered the second most reliable diesel engine ever produced. It was significantly overbuilt and over-engineered for the power levels that it produces, which give it an extremely strong block and internals. And so the block and internals themselves, are virtually bulletproof. The only diesel engine that is considered to be more reliable than this is the 12-valve 5.9 Cummins. With that being said, there were two generations of 7.3 Powerstrokes. The first generation was from 1994 until 1998, and then in 1999, the engine received a new turbocharger, new injectors, a lift pump was added, and new transmission options were added as well. And so the second gen lasted from 1999 until 2003. And in addition to those changes that were made on the second gen ones, they also got a pretty decent horsepower and torque increase as well. However, power levels kind of vary depending on what year your truck is, as well as what transmission you have. So before we get into the list of problems, I want to go ahead and kind of preface this list by saying that this is an extremely reliable engine. However, you might not think so after we go through this list, because I have a list of 8 common problems here for the 7.3 Powerstroke, and having a list of 8 problems might not necessarily make you think that this is an extremely reliable engine, but the one thing that I do want to point out is that this engine has a B50 life of 350,000 miles. And so what that means is 50% of these engines make it to 350,000 miles or beyond without experiencing complete engine failure. And so there are a lot of systems, sensors and small things that do go wrong on these engines, but when it comes to the actual engine and the major engine components themselves, these things are virtually bulletproof and can last, well beyond 350,000 miles when properly taken care of. So moving into the actual common problems of this engine, the first one is the camshaft position sensor. The camshaft position sensor fails extremely frequently. It's probably the #1 most common problem on these engines. However, they're extremely easy to replace and they cost like 23 bucks. But they do fail so frequently that we actually recommend you buy an extra one and put it in your glove box, just because when it does fail, it'll create a no start issue, or your engine will start and then die quickly after. And so you can't drive if the sensor goes bad, and so it can leave you stuck on the side of the highway. However, replacing the sensor is extremely easy to do, and like I said, it's a very inexpensive sensor, and so keeping one of them sitting around in your glove box is a smart thing to do, just considering how frequently they fail. And just one caveat, there have been a number of different camshaft position sensors that have been made over the years. As of right now, the best one on the market is the dark gray and the purple one, just for a heads up. The second common problem on the list is the IPR valve, which is the injection pressure regulator. The IPR valve sits on the high pressure oil pump and helps regulate oil pressure. The regulator itself often gets stuck. There's a seal on it that fails. The sensor goes bad, and sometimes the wire can get corroded and go bad as well. And so there's a number of issues with the valve itself that do go wrong. However, it works in conjunction with the HUE injection system, and therefore when it goes bad, it can cause the engine to get too much or too little fuel, which can cause a myriad of performance related issues. A new valve is like $200, and so a lot of people end up just rebuilding the valve. A rebuild kit's like $15, and it's super simple to do, and so you can rebuild it and replace it in your garage very cheaply and very easily. And so while it is also another common problem, it's another very inexpensive and easy to fix problem. The third problem on our list is with the fuel filter housing. The fuel filter housing itself is made of aluminum, and so there's really no issues with that. However, the cap on it is made of plastic, and there's an O-ring that sits inside of the cap, and that O-ring can wear out from time to time and cause a leak. But the most common thing is the cap cracking, just since it sits in the engine bay, it's in a high heat location, and it's plastic, it can crack and cause a leak from the fuel filter housing, and then it'll leak fuel into your engine bay. Replacing it, again, extremely easy, extremely inexpensive. It's simply a cap or an O-ring, and something that you can do in your garage. Another thing that goes with the fuel filter housing is the fuel filter itself. This isn't necessarily a common problem for the 7.3 Powerstroke. It's more so a common problem for any diesel engine. Diesel fuel is inherently more dirty than gasoline fuel is, and so we always recommend replacing fuel filters every 30,000 miles, just because they do get clogged up more frequently than you would see on a gas engine. And so the fuel filter can get clogged frequently on these engines, which can become a problem as well. But like I said, replace it frequently every 30,000 miles and make sure you're getting, high quality diesel fuel, and that should help mitigate any issues with that system. The fourth problem on the list is with the up pipe. The up pipe connects the turbo to the exhaust manifold, and it has a gasket within it that's called a crush gasket. The design on that gasket's not great, and the gasket fails a lot, and so the gasket needs to be replaced. Otherwise you end up with a small exhaust leak. Typically when this gasket goes bad, a lot of people will actually upgrade to a performance up pipe, just since there are some power gains that you can get out of it. There also are some other kind of non-OEM style gaskets that don't fail as frequently, but the OEM style crush gasket does fail a lot. And so whether you want to replace that gasket, get a different aftermarket style gasket, or get a performance up pipe, this again isn't a huge or costly kind of problem with the 7.3 Powerstroke. Fifth on the list is the exhaust back pressure valve, or the EBPV. This valve is mounted to the turbo outlet and then has an actuator that connects to the turbo itself. Essentially what it does is controls exhaust back pressure to regulate kind of engine temperatures and help your engine heat up more quickly. And so when you just start your engine, the EBPV will close the valve, which creates back pressure in the exhaust system. That back pressure creates more heat, which then helps get the engine up to operating temperature more quickly. Now, the valve itself is prone to leaking oil because the actuator is oil pressure kind of operated. So it can leak oil, the actuator itself can fail, and that leaves you with either needing to replace, rebuild, or just delete the valve itself. Because rebuilding it or replacing it is a little bit more expensive, it's common, and because it's a common problem on these engines, just deleting the whole system is typically the route that people go. It's not necessarily, it's not a necessary system to have on your engine. and you can operate, just fine without it. And so rather than replacing it and dealing with it potentially failing again in the future, a lot of people just delete it. And so you can get a delete kit and do that rather than going through the rebuild or replacement process, which is going to cost more than just deleting it would. 6 on our list is the injector driver module, and or the IDM module. This module essentially regulates voltage from the battery to the injectors because the injectors need a specific amount of voltage to operate, and so the IDM works with the ECM to determine how much voltage the injectors need, and then it regulates that voltage and then sends it through the under valve cover harness, which then sends the voltage to the injectors. The IDM is located within the wheel well, the driver's side wheel well, and so just because of its location, it's easy to get water in it, dirt, dust, debris, and so it fails frequently just from its frequent contact with water and other kind of road debris, especially if you do a lot of off-roading. And so this module goes bad commonly because of that. And when it does go bad, it will cause issues with all of the injectors, and so it will cause fueling issues because it controls voltage to all of the injectors. You'll notice issues across all of the cylinders. The 7th problem on our list is also associated with the IDM system, or the injector kind of voltage regulation. This issue is with the under valve cover harness, and so the IDM takes the voltage from the battery and then it passes it, regulates it, and then passes it to the under valve cover harness, which then delivers the voltage to each one of the individual injectors. As the name suggests, it sits underneath the valve cover, and a lot of heat gets built up under the valve cover, so the wires frequently melt. Also, the engine vibrations can cause the wires to rub up against the valves and break from that, and so it is common to have failure among some of the wiring in there. However, when the wiring typically fails, it'll fail on a kind of per cylinder basis, just since the harness, there are 2 harnesses, each one of them controls 4 different cylinders, but typically it's only 1 cylinder at a time that'll melt or break, and so usually you'll have fueling issues with just 1 cylinder, whereas if you have an issue with the whole IDM module, you're going to notice issues across all of the cylinders and all of the injectors. Again, this is a pretty simple problem to fix. It's about $65 for the harness, and accessing it is extremely simple once you remove the valve cover. So it's very simple, very simple harness to access, very easy to replace. The same goes for the IDM module, just because it's easily and conveniently located within the fender. It's easy to get to, easy to replace. And so both the IDM and under valve cover harness issues are, another problem that are relatively inexpensive and easy to fix. And that leads us to the 8th problem and our last kind of common problem on here, but I will preface that this is not really a common problem, or at least not a problem for stock 7.3 Powerstrokes. However, there is an issue with the valve springs and the push rods. The valve springs have a low seat pressure, which can cause a lot of valve float when power is added to these engines, and issues with those valve springs can cause the push rods to get bent. And so this typically is only an issue for 7.3s that are running an upgraded turbo as well as running upgraded fueling. If you are doing a high horsepower build, you likely want to go ahead and get some valve springs that have a higher seat pressure, as well as look into replacing the push rods as well. But like I said, this really only affects 7.3s that have an upgraded turbo and upgraded fueling. And so if you just have a couple bolt-on mods and a tune, you shouldn't have any issues with the springs or the push rods. So not something that concerns us in terms of general reliability when we look at the 7.3 Powerstroke on a stock basis. And that covers our list of 8 common problems. Like I said, the list is long, but the one common theme across all of them, which you likely noticed, is that everything is extremely easy to replace. with the exception of the exhaust back pressure valve. That's kind of probably the most difficult to replace thing on the list. But outside of that, everything on here is inexpensive, easy to access, and easy to DIY. And so while there are a lot of problems, we would say the majority of these problems are so minor that it really doesn't, affect the, reputation for reliability that the 7.3 Powerstroke has. Like we said, this is widely considered the second most reliable diesel engine ever. And so while it will have these small sensor and wiring related issues, especially as these engines are now 20 plus years old, there's virtually zero issues with the block and the major engine components, so long as you properly take care of the vehicle, change the oil filter and change your oil on a timely basis, change the fuel filter, and just keep up with your basic maintenance, and these engines will easily last past 350,000 miles. But of course, to get to that mileage and beyond it, there's going to be a number of, other systems and smaller components like the things on this list that you're going to need to replace. As always, we do have an associated article written for this video here, and so I know for a lot of these issues, just since there were so many, I didn't discuss what the symptoms were for each of these problems. And so if you are looking to diagnose some of the issues with your 7.3 Powerstroke, I recommend going and visiting our article where we do list out all of the symptoms as well as replacement options, which can help you track down what your specific issue is by looking at the signs and symptoms that we mentioned for each of the associated problems. So with that being said, that covers our video on 7.3 Powerstroke Common Problems. It's a fantastic engine. Like I said, I have one. I absolutely love it. It's a complete beast and great engine. So if you liked this content, I would appreciate it if you gave us a like, hit the subscribe button, and leave any comments down below. I'll do my best to get back to you. That being said, we'll see you in the next video.